our forts and castles are located. And you do know that Ghana has been certified by UNESCO as having the highest number of forts and castles. So we acknowledge especially our members of parliament from these constituencies. We also acknowledge the respected Mr. Benjamin Crump, civil rights activist. We acknowledge Reverend Al Sharpton. We acknowledge our friends from the United Nations multilateral establishment, distinguished invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. We gather here today in remembrance of millions of Africans whose lives were violently truncated by the transatlantic slave trade, a system that for centuries reduced our forebears to commodities and turned entire societies into sources of labor and unjust profit. Across the shores of West Africa, including in my country, Ghana, the stone walls of forts and castles such as Cape Coast, Elmina, still stand as silent witnesses to this vast machinery of human exploitation, through which more than 12 million Africans were captured, forced across the Atlantic, and subjected to racialized chattel enslavement. Before we speak of justice, policy, or diplomacy, it is fitting that we pause to honor the memory of those men, women, and children whose suffering under this system helped shape the modern world while denying them the most basic recognition of their humanity. Earlier today, we were honored to have His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana, lead us on a solemn commemorative remembrance at the African Burial Ground National Monument here in New York. We honored the memory of men, women, and children whose lives were shaped by the transatlantic slave trade. Excellencies, it is both solemn and gratifying to see that the international community is gathered here today to reflect on the enduring legacy of this profound injustice, convened on the eve of the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. This high-level event offers us an opportunity for the global community to confront history with honesty, to honor the resilience of those who endured unimaginable suffering, and to reaffirm a shared commitment to reparatory justice and healing for Africans and people of African descent. In convening this high-level gathering, Ghana does so with a deep awareness of history and responsibility. Along our coastline stands the forts and castles through which countless Africans passed before the long and brutal journey into enslavement. These sites remain enduring reminders of a crime that shaped the destinies of continents and peoples. In the 15th century, ships began arriving on the shores of the Gold Coast in what is today the Republic of Ghana. From that moment, a dark chapter in human history began to unfold as Africa became the epicenter of a vast system of human exploitation that would reshape societies across continents. It is therefore no coincidence that this story began on the shores of the Gold Coast, a land long associated with the rising sun. If the sun rose over the beginning of this tragedy on our shores, then it must not set on the conscience of humanity until justice is done. It is therefore with humility and determination that Ghana, in its capacity as the African Union champion on advancing the cause of justice and the payment of reparations for Africans and the people of African descent, has sought to provide a platform for renewed international reflection and dialogue on this defining chapter of human history. Excellencies, the legacies of slavery continue to resonate in the present across societies and continents. The historical injustice of the slave trade and racialized enslavement remains visible in patterns of racial discrimination, economic disparity, and structural inequality. Your Excellencies, this gathering therefore takes place at a moment of renewed global reflection on historical injustice and its enduring consequences. In recent years, the international community has given greater attention to questions of historical accountability and the rights of people of African descent across Africa and throughout the diaspora. Efforts are underway to document and preserve the historical evidence of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. Governments, scholars, and civil society organizations are working to recover archival records, lived testimonies, and material artifacts that bear witness of this history. Initiatives such as Barbados Reclaiming Our Atlantic Destiny Road Program illustrate how societies are seeking to safeguard these records and ensure that voices long silenced by history are documented and remembered. It is within this broader context that today's high-level special event has been convened. The gathering offers the international community an opportunity to reflect collectively on the historical realities of the trafficking in enslaved Africans and the racialized chattel enslavement of Africans, to reaffirm our shared commitment to justice and equality, and to deepen dialogue on pathways toward reparatory justice. It also provides an important platform for listening to diverse voices, scholars, advocates, policymakers, and leaders who continue to advance understanding and engagement on these issues. Today's meeting will throw further light on the historic resolution that President Mahama is tabling tomorrow to declare the transatlantic slave trade as the gravest crime against humanity. This effort is not directed toward reopening the divisions of history, but toward affirming historical truth and strengthening our collective commitment to justice, dignity, and equality. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Ghana is deeply grateful to the many partners who have joined in supporting this initiative. We acknowledge with appreciation the African Union, the Caribbean Community, CELAC, member states across regions, all regions of the world, I must emphasize, because President Mahama's resolution, as you have recognized, is co-sponsored by member states from all regions of our world. We also acknowledge global experts, civil society organizations. We deeply appreciate the contributions of the Congressional Black Caucus, civil rights activists in the United States of America, including Reverend Al Sharpton, Mr. Benjamin Crump, and other young activists from the New York Reparations Committee, and many others who continue to support President Mahama's initiative. As we begin today's discussions, we do so mindful that remembrance carries responsibility. Honoring the victims of this tragedy requires more than recalling the past. It calls on us to recognize the humanity that was denied to them, deepen our understanding of this history, and strengthen our commitment to building a world in which dignity, equality, and justice are upheld for all peoples. Before I conclude, Your Excellencies, let me express Ghana's appreciation to His Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, for generously supporting this initiative and permitting Ghana to convene this important high-level gathering here at the United Nations. I also would like to specially commend His Excellency John Dramani Mahama for the guidance, the vision, the courage, and the resilience in leading the African continent, all people of African descent, and indeed, all people with good conscience in our world on this historic path to reparatory justice and restitution. Posterity will certainly be kind to President Mahama and all of us in this room who remain committed to this defining process. It is my hope that today's dialogue will deepen our collective reflection and strengthen our resolve to confront the legacies of the past with honesty and to advance the cause of justice for Africans and all people of African descent. I thank you very much.
We thank you, Honorable Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Ghana, Sam Okujeto Ablakwa. It's now my pleasure to call upon the Commissioner for Health, Humanitarian Affairs, and Social Development from the African Union, Her Excellency Ama Chum Amwa.
Thank you. Your Excellency President John Dramani Mahama of the Republic of Ghana, Osaberi Kwesi Atta II, Uguaman Hene of the Cape Coast Traditional Area, Honorable Ministers, Chef de Cabinet of the UN Secretary General, Excellencies, Permanent Representatives of the United Nations Member States, representatives of peoples of African descent, esteemed members of UN, AU, and CARICOM reparations mechanisms, distinguished scholars and experts, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to address this distinguished gathering on behalf of the chairperson of the African Union Commission. He conveys warm fraternal greetings and expresses deep appreciation for the convening of this high-level event, which brings together leaders, partners, and stakeholders united in advancing justice for Africans and people of African descent. While the chairperson is unable to be present in person, I am deeply honored to convey his statement on his behalf, reflecting the collective voice and unwavering commitment of the African Union to the cause of reparatory justice. Kindly permit me, therefore, to deliver the statement of the chairperson of the African Union Commission. And it reads, "It is a profound honor to address you at this high-level event on reparatory justice for the trafficking of enslaved Africans and the racialized chattel enslavement of Africans. I wish at the outset to express high appreciation to His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana, for his leadership in convening this important meeting and for his invaluable contribution and custodianship as the African Union leader on advancing the cause of justice and payment of reparations to Africans and people of African descent. I also wish to recognize the invaluable contribution of His Excellency Faure Gnassingbé, President of the Council of the Republic of Togo, for the leadership in hosting the 9th Pan-African Congress in Lomé last year and in tabling the successive AU Assembly decisions on qualification of slavery, deportation, and colonization as crimes against humanity and genocide against peoples of Africa. We meet today not only to remember what was done to Africa and her scattered children, but to act together so that history's open wound becomes a site of healing, reconstruction, and renewal. I wish to highlight that in my annual report earlier this year to the Assembly of Heads of State and Government of the African Union, I stressed that reparatory justice is no longer a peripheral moral appeal. It is now a structured continental program anchored in our Agenda 2063 and its second 10-year implementation plan. Through Assembly Decision 884, our leaders designated 2025 as the African Union theme of the year, Justice for Africans and People of African Descent through Reparations. This transformed reparations from a slogan of conscience into an organizing principle of policy, a bridge between historical truth and development sovereignty, between memory and the transformation of global power relations. Across our union, we have treated reparatory justice as a cross-cutting enabler, not a narrow sector. Over the past year, the African Union has taken decisive steps to give this agenda an institutional backbone. We established a coordination team on reparations housed in our Citizens and Diaspora Directorate to ensure that every department, organ, specialized agency, and liaison office carries part of this responsibility. Pursuant to the mandates given by our Assembly and Executive Council, we constituted and convened the African Union Committee of Experts on Reparations and the African Union Reference Group of Legal Experts on Reparations, whose inception meeting in December 2025 developed substantive framework papers and working groups on legal foundations, modalities of reparations, and global advocacy. These mechanisms signal a simple truth, that Africa is organizing for justice. Excellencies, distinguished participants, at the political level, our Assembly has spoken with unprecedented clarity. In Decision 934 of February 2025, and reaffirmed in February 2026, the Union has decided to qualify transatlantic enslavement, deportation, and colonization as crimes against humanity and acts of genocide against the peoples of Africa, and to work collectively for their recognition as such at the international level. This is a watershed moment. To name these atrocities clearly is to remove the last veils of ambiguity from the historical record. It is to say that what was done to Africans was not a tragic accident of history, but the result of deliberate policies whose legacies structure today's inequalities. Justice begins with calling things by their proper names. Our union has also endorsed the outcomes of major continental and diaspora processes that give this agenda concrete direction. The Assembly welcomed the International Conference on the Crimes of Colonization in Africa held in Algiers from 30th November to 1st December 2025 and endorsed its declaration as a contribution to the criminalization of colonialism and the pursuit of reparations. By this, the heads of state and government designated 30th November as the African Day of African Matters and Victims of Transatlantic Slave Trade, Colonization, and Apartheid. The Republic of Togo, in coordination with the Commission, convened the 9th Pan-African Congress in Lomé from 8th to 12th December 2025 under the theme Renewal of Pan-Africanism and Africa's Role in Multilateral Institutional Reform to mobilize resources and reinvent for action. And our Assembly has endorsed the final declaration and master plan. These two instruments call for strengthened continental and diasporic cooperation, for the restitution of cultural property, and for mechanisms of reparation and recognition of historical crimes. One powerful example of this broader reparatory vision is the initiative to correct the map of Africa on the globe, proposed by the Republic of Togo and welcomed by our Assembly. The method projection used for centuries shrinks Africa on the world map, distorting its true size, and by extension, contributing to the minimalization of its economic, cultural, and geopolitical significance. In response, our leaders have decided to adopt the Equal Earth cartographic projection to more accurately represent Africa and have urged member states to revise their curricula accordingly. This is more than a technical choice. It is an act of cognitive justice. Excellencies, distinguished participants, we've also extended our temporal horizon. Our Assembly has endorsed the extension of the 2025 theme of the year into a 2026-2035 decade of justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations, a theme that can initiate a decade that can institutionalize. By adopting this decade, we are committing ourselves to long-term action, better resourced expert mechanisms, integration into national policies and school curricula, sustained diplomatic engagement and closer coordination with African groups in Geneva, New York, and other multilateral centers. The decade is our way of telling history that we will no longer visit justice as a temporary guest. We are giving it a permanent address in our institutions. Reparations, in our understanding, are not only about the past, they are also about rebalancing the present and securing the future. Several decisions adopted by our leaders envision and inspire aligning the reparations agenda with structural reforms in global governance, including the UN Security Council, as well as those related to finance, trade, technology, and environmental, through effective participation in the reform of multilateral institutions and in climate and digital justice debates. The two new AU mechanisms on restorative justice have thus formed a working group on a global governance structural reparations, which would focus its attention on this crucial aspect of the justice and reparations agenda. Reparations to the pursuit of justice, cultural renewal, scientific and technological equity, and the fight against structural global asymmetries. In that sense, reparations are like restoring a river whose source needs replenishment. They involve not only ensuring the water downstream, but also transforming the systems that cause the shortage to occur, so that new injustices do not perpetuate old ones. Excellencies, our partnerships with the wider African diaspora are central to this vision. In 2025, we operationalized the AU Curriculum Memorandum of Understanding on upscaling engagement with people of African descent. And together, we convened the second Africa Curriculum Summit at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa on 7 September 2025. That summit adopted the Addis Ababa Declaration on Transcontinental Partnerships in pursuit of reparatory justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations, which our Assembly has adopted this year as a guiding framework. This partnership has now expanded further, with restorative justice being one of the main pillars of the first CELAC Africa Forum, which has convened in Bogota only last week. In practical terms, we are building a transoceanic architecture of solidarity so that the descendants of those scattered by the enslavement ships can now sit together at the captain's table of global decision-making. We have also stepped up our engagement with the United Nations system and contributed to the adoption of key resolutions in the Human Rights Council that place reparatory justice at the center of multilateral deliberations. We are now leaping to another front under the leadership of His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, the African Union leader on advancing the cause of justice and payment of reparations to Africans within the UN's General Assembly, declaring the trafficking of enslaved Africans and racialized chattel enslavement of Africans as the gravest crime against humanity in line with AU Assembly Decisions 884 and 934. For the first time, we are also preparing to host a session of the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent on African soil at the AU headquarters in Addis Ababa. These steps show that Africa does not come to the UN only as petitioners. It comes as non-entrepreneur, as a continent determined to co-author the rules of global justice. Excellencies, distinguished participants, allow me in closing to offer 3 invitations to this distinguished audience. First, I invite you to join us in fully implementing the Decade of Justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations, including by integrating its priorities into national policies, educational and cultural frameworks, and diplomatic strategies. Let us ensure that every child in the world learns a history that is truthful about the crimes of transatlantic enslavement, colonialism, and apartheid, and hopeful about the possibilities of repair. Second, I invite the United Nations system and beyond to work with us to transform recognition into restitution, reform, and repair. This means supporting normative developments that reflect the qualification of transatlantic enslavement, deportation, and colonization as crimes against humanity and acts of genocide, backing initiatives such as the correction of global cartography as an act of cognitive justice, and aligning development cooperation with the objectives outlined in the Algiers Declaration, the Lomé 9th Pan-African Congress outcomes, and the Addis Ababa Africa CARICOM Declaration. Justice is not a speech act. It is a budget line, a curriculum change, a treaty reform, a returned artifact, a reconstructed institution. Third, I invite civil society, scholars, artists, youth, and social movements to continue to be the conscience of this agenda, resting on the African continent's initiative since the Abuja Declaration on Reparations in 1993 to this upcoming General Assembly resolution in 2026. Citizens are invited to keep the flame of reparatory justice lit. Today, you have an institutional home to that light through the Citizens and Diaspora Directorate of the African Union Commission to galvanize the energy of the defendants of reparatory justice across the globe. Africa, once diminished on maps, now insists on being seen at its true scale. Geographically, historically, morally, culturally, economically, diplomatically, and globally. The journey from enslavement to justice, from colonization to liberation, from apartheid segregation to equitable integration is not yet complete. It must pass through the path of reparatory justice to reach true equality. As Kwame Nkrumah reminded us, we face neither east nor west. We faced forward. Today, that forward path is clear. It is a path of truth, a path of justice, a path of restoration. Excellencies, distinguished participants, let this not be remembered as another moment of reflection, but as a moment of resolve, a moment when Africa and its diaspora stood together, not to ask for justice, but to organize for it, a moment when the world moved beyond acknowledgement to restitution, to reform, and to repair, and a moment when history itself began to turn, not by chance, but by the collective will of a people determined to reclaim their dignity. Let us rise from this gathering with one shared conviction that the injustice of centuries will not outlive the determination of this generation. And when future generations look back, let them say that this was the moment when the world began not only to correct its history, but to correct its conscience. I thank you.
We thank you, Her Excellency Commissioner Ama Chum Amwa from the African Union. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, in just a moment, we are going to have the keynote address by the President of the Republic of Ghana, which will be coming from the podium there. But before that, I'm going to plead with you, if you have the little earpieces, to deploy them now, because the next speech is coming in Portuguese, and my pleasure to welcome to speak to us His Excellency Dionisio Manuel da Fonseca, Minister of State and Chief of the Civil House of the Republic of Angola. Minister, the floor is yours. And please, if you have the earpiece, there will be interpretation. Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Your Excellency John Dramani Mahama, President of the Republic of Ghana, Your Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, distinguished Chairperson of the African Union Commission, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to represent His Excellency João Manuel Gonçalves Lourenço, President of the Republic of Angola, at this high-level event on reparatory justice for the trafficking of enslaved Africans and the racialized enslavement of Africans, an initiative of His Excellency John Dramani Mahama, which the Republic of Angola joins and supports. Excellencies, slavery was the greatest barbarity committed against Africans. It left deep scars on our societies that have persisted for centuries. The African citizen was subjugated and mistreated. Many were killed while being transported as merchandise and subject to forced labor for the benefit of the colonial powers and their citizens. These territories developed at the cost of the blood of African citizens who were denied the most basic human rights. The holding of these events on reparatory justice for enslaved Africans here in New York, United States of America, is for Angola a meaningful coincidence, as historical records indicate that William Tucker, son of Anthony and Isabel, the first person of African descent born in 1624 in Jamestown, Virginia, the first British colony in the Americas, was of Angolan origin. Between the 15th and 19th centuries, many Angolans were captured and exported in a barbaric manner to perform slave labor and to contribute to the development of the then European powers, as well as the other territories under their control. Africans and people of African descent have contributed and continue to contribute in a very significant way to economic development, as well as to the promotion of democracy, culture, and political and civil rights at the global level. Reparatory justice is not a favor, nor merely a form of compensation, because the harm caused to Africans is difficult, if not possible, to measure. Reparatory justice is a measure that recognizes the pain and suffering inflicted on the victims of historical injustice and seeks to correct the wrongs of the past, restoring the dignity of marginalized and dehumanized communities and individuals. This justice should not be limited to financial compensation, but should also include recognition of the need for and the concrete realization of greater participation by African countries and peoples in major multilateral fora, notably through the reform of the United Nations of the Security Council. It should also include the cancellation of African countries' debts, the return of historical and cultural heritage removed from Africa, and investments in initiatives and projects that promote balanced development and the inclusion of Africans and people of African descent, ensuring the prosperity of African nations. It is furthermore crucial to ensure that the financial resources illicitly removed from Africa can be returned and allocated to the constructions of infrastructure infrastructure and to other projects identified and defined by Africans themselves for their development. It is unacceptable that such resources, so necessary for Africa's inclusive progress, particularly for its youth, continue to be withheld from Africans. We cannot remain still in the face of so many injustices. It is time to act, to provide reparation, to restore, and to strengthen the foundations of a more just and equitable global society. May we unite to transform this dark past into a future of hope and prosperity for all. Thank you.
Muito obrigado. Thank you very much. His Excellency Dionisio Manuel da Fonseca. Just before we proceed, I want to acknowledge the presence of Reverend Al Sharpton, founder and president of the National Action Network. We also have with us a distinguished woman, Professor Vereen Shepherd, Jamaican historian and professor, University of the West Indies. Respect, Professor. Also here, we have Mr. Justin Hansford, representing with Dorothy Davis, the Congressional Black Caucus. Justin Hansford is the U.S. independent expert on the Permanent Forum on the People of African Descent. We acknowledge you. Excellencies, distinguished professors, panelists, distinguished permanent representatives representing the member states of the United Nations, allies of Ghana in the cause of the African Union, allies from the Caribbean, from CARICOM, and from all parts of the world, distinguished guests. It is my honor, my privilege right now to introduce us to the African champion or African Union champion for reparations, His Excellency, the President of the Republic of Ghana, John Dramani Mahama. Can we welcome him, please?
Thank you very much. You may be seated. That was quite a surprise. Yeah, but thank you for that beautiful display of African culture. The chef de cabinet of the Secretary General of the United Nations, the Honorable Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ghana, and senior government officials, the chairman for this occasion, Osaberima Kwesiata II, who's the paramount chief of the Ogoa traditional area, Reverend Al Sharpton, thank you for joining us at the African Burial Grounds this morning. Thank you very much. Members of the Congressional Black Caucus are here. Let's recognize you. Thank you very much. And for one of time, let me recognize our brothers from CARICOM, from Africa, and from everywhere in the world. Your Excellencies, distinguished representatives of member states of the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, truth begins with language, with the power that words hold to shape consciousness and to shift perspectives to propel an action or other. I therefore offer this truth as a starting point. There's no such thing as a slave. There were human beings who were trafficked and then enslaved by people who believed they could own those human beings as chattels, as their personal property. Some will hear this and think I'm splitting hairs. Isn't that the same thing, they might ask? No, it's not. Not at all the same thing. Not if you acknowledge an individual's humanity. Not if you respect an individual's basic right to dignity. The entire transatlantic slave trade was designed to deny African people their humanity. And that denial was premised on a racial hierarchy with no basis in fact or science, a racial hierarchy that deemed whiteness superior and blackness inferior. The atrocities that were committed against enslaved Africans, the myriads of injustice that were born of slavery and carried forward into successive social framework, took place specifically because those persons were considered objects, not human beings. So when discussing slavery and its resulting institutions and practices, we must always start by reclaiming racial equality, the dignity of Africans, the humanity of our ancestors who were enslaved, and as a matter of course, our own humanity. Recently, someone asked me to explain the importance of the resolution on the declaration of the trafficking of enslaved Africans and racialized chattel enslavement of Africans as the gravest crime against humanity. And I responded without pause or hesitation, and I'd like to share what I told him. This resolution allows us as a global community to collectively bear witness to the plight of about more than 12.5 million men, women, and children whose homes, communities, names, families, hopes, dreams, futures, and lives were stolen from them over the course of 400 years. I speak these words today not only for Ghana, but also in solidarity with the rest of Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, and the wider diaspora, and indeed all people of good conscience throughout the world. This resolution is a pathway to healing and reparative justice. This resolution is a safeguard against forgetting. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, violence begins with language. When words are weaponized or to codify abuse, when people are called out of their names, regardless of their state of dress, when slaves were captured, They were always stripped of their clothing while being kept in the dungeons of the fortresses that had been built on the African coast by the European traders. They were forced with their limbs chained and shackled into the hold of cargo ships. They remained naked, packed like sardines during the month-long journey through the Middle Passage. Not all those who were loaded onto the ships survived the voyage. A number of the ships sank with their entire human cargo. Others who fell sick were thrown overboard. And a few who preferred death to captivity voluntarily jumped overboard. It is believed that 10 to 20% of enslaved people died in the Middle Passage. Whenever a ship arrived at its destination, the enslaved people, still naked, were taken to the market where they were inspected and appraised like livestock. They were then placed on an auction block in front of an audience of potential buyers and sold to the highest bidder. Once they arrived on the plantation where they would work and live for a lifetime, they were also stripped of their names. And so you were no longer Fatu or Kofi or Bubakar or Nanayao or Emenka, Nayong or Hamisu. You were given names like Ben, Jemima, John, Toby, or Mary. In addition to these new names, they were also called girl or boy, regardless of how old you were. And maybe I should also say that filthy N-word. If you ever needed a surname, it would be that of your master. And sometimes they were branded like cattle with the plantation's insignia or logo. There were sugar plantations. There were also coffee, cotton, tobacco, and cocoa plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas. South America had diamond and gold mines as well. And also the production of indigo took place in Jamaica. The people who were enslaved labored on those plantations from sunrise to sunset. And the conditions under which they worked were brutal. They were beaten occasionally to the point of death. They were underfed. They were kept in cramped quarters and often died young, if not from labor, then from disease. There are even records of some enslaved women who were kept as breeders. Let's not mince words, ladies and gentlemen. Business was booming because when labor is free, profit margins are huge. African lives were disposable. If too many of the enslaved Africans died, more were captured from their homes on the continent, enslaved and trafficked. During conversations about slavery, the point at which euphemisms are introduced, and there's a rush to talk about abolition. But we cannot afford to look away. This is precisely the part when we should pay close attention, because the devil is in the detail. And I'm going to share 4 trafficking destinations with you. Remember, when you hear these numbers, that it's not about data. These are about human beings and human lives. Roughly 6 million enslaved Africans were trafficked to Brazil, which is the 5th largest nation in the world, stretching 4,400 kilometers from north to south and 4,320 kilometers from east to west. Almost 2 million enslaved Africans were trafficked to Jamaica, which was the most profitable of all sugar-producing locations. Jamaica is 235 kilometers long and between 34 and 84 kilometers wide, depending on which point you are located. About 500,000 enslaved Africans were trafficked to America from the early 17th century, when the first ship arrived, to the 19th century, when chattel slavery was eventually abolished. America grew from 3 colonies to an independent nation with 36 states. Over 450,000 enslaved Africans were trafficked to Barbados, an island that is 34 kilometers wide and 34 kilometers long and 23 kilometers wide. Before the trafficking of enslaved Africans, plantation labor in Barbados came from white indentured servants who were usually Irish. There were 2 major problems with indentured servants. One was that they eventually had to be granted their freedom. And the other was that if they ran away, catching them proved challenging because they blended in, they were white. In 1661, Barbados enacted a code for the enslaved. And in the preamble, it said, Negroes are described as, and I quote, a heathenish, brutish, and uncertain, dangerous kind of people, quotations closed. It goes on to explain that this is why there must be a set of laws detailing how they should be punished. Clause 2 of the same code details what to do if any Negro man or woman shall offer any violence to any Christian, as by striking or the like. And it goes on to say that if it is a first offense, the Negro should be severely whipped by the constable. However, if it's the Negro's second offense, he shall be severely whipped, his nose slit, and be burned in the face. The code gave owners and overseers the ability to torture, maim, and even kill enslaved Africans with impunity. And it became something of a template for the rest of the Anglo-Atlantic world. In 1662, a year after Barbados enacted this code, a legal doctrine was established to set judicial precedent in the American colony of Virginia. It was titled Partus Sequitur Ventrum, for those of you who understand Latin, which translates from Latin as, what is born follows the womb. This legal framework ensured that all children born of enslaved women would also automatically be enslaved regardless of who the father was. And it is important to note that many enslaved women were impregnated because they were raped by the plantation owners or their overseers. But what this law did, even in cases where a baby was not the product of rape, was to strip the child of its paternity in the eyes of the law. That child, as an enslaved person, was property that could be given or sold at its owner's whim. The doctrine was adopted throughout the Americas, including in Brazil. People sometimes try to put a disclaimer on slavery by insisting that you cannot use the social norms of today to judge the actions and events that took place in the past. Well, such people are loud and wrong. Just because everybody is doing something doesn't make it right. Slavery is wrong now, and it was wrong then. For as long as Africans have been trafficked and enslaved, there have been abolitionists who have spoken up against it. The first slave ship landed in America in 1619. Opposition to chattel slavery was voiced and mentioned in passing in documents, but in 1688, the German town Friends, a group of Quakers, put out a formal written protest against slavery. And in it they wrote, and let me quote, "Now, though they are black, we cannot conceive there is more liberty to have them slaves as it is to have other white ones. There's a saying that we shall do to all men like as we would have done to ourselves, making no difference of what generation, descent, or color they are." Quotations close. Your Excellencies, erasure begins with language. When words are used as a sleight of hand to gaslight, to trick you into doubting what you know to be true. It is when words are used to create mythology. When they are spoken, the volume gradually decreases with each repetition until it becomes a full verbal reduction. The legendary American jazz player Miles Davis said, and I quote, "It's not the notes you play, it's the notes you don't play." When it comes to the contributions that Africa has made to enriching Europe and building the so-called New World, the silence is deafening. We have paved roads through mountains, we've put down railroad tracks, we've constructed buildings, laying brick after brick. We have cut sugar, cane, we've picked cocoa and cotton, we've descended into mines to unearth precious metals and stones, and we have wet nurse babies. We've paid the price of admission with the blood of our ancestors, and still what greets us at the door is silence. What we're met with is mythology. And I'll explain what mythology I mean. In 2015, McGraw-Hill Education, one of the largest publishers in the United States, released a geography textbook that is used in over 1,000 school districts in Texas. The book stated that millions of workers were brought from Africa to work on agricultural plantations. It said workers, not slaves. A family complained, and the book was pulled off the shelves. But now there's another one. There's a U.S. organization called PragerU. I hope I got the pronunciation right. PragerU or PragerU. On the organization's website, it's described as the world's leading conservative nonprofit that is focused on changing minds through the creative use of digital media. Now look what they did. They created animated videos which are used as supplemental educational material in public school classrooms in 11 states. And in one video, they used a young boy and his teenage sister. And this young boy and his teenage sister are confused about why some people celebrate Columbus Day and others celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day. This organization uses a time travel app, and this young teenager and his sister find themselves on a ship with Christopher Columbus, who tells them all about how the Carib people, the indigenous people of the Lesser Antilles in the Caribbean, were violent and uncivilized cannibals. The children then ask him to explain why he'd enslaved people. To that, Christopher Columbus is said to have responded, "Slavery is as old as time, and it has taken place in every corner of the world," normalization. And he says, being taken as a slave is better than being killed. No, I don't see the problem. Columbus then accuses the children of coming to his time and trying to judge him by the standards of their time. In another animated video, the same brother and sister use the same time travel app and find themselves in the year 1852, standing in front of Frederick Douglass. And he tells them that he is working to abolish slavery, a system in which people make other people work for long hours with no pay. The sad fact, he explains, is that slavery has existed everywhere in the world for thousands of years. Here in the United States, Black history courses are being removed from school curricula. Schools are being mandated to stop teaching students about the truth of slavery, segregation, and racism in American history courses. Books about those topics are being banned in schools and public libraries. Museums, art centers, and other institutions whose budgets rely in any way on public funds are being prohibited from scheduling exhibitions and programs or from displaying materials promoting racial awareness or Black history. Much like the law that was put in place to regulate the punishment of the enslaved in Barbados, these policies are becoming a template for other governments as well as some private institutions. At the very least, they are slowly normalizing the erasure. They are slowly normalizing erasure. Earlier, when discussing the importance of this resolution, I said it was a safeguard against forgetting. This is the type of forgetting that I was referring to. But there are other types of forgetting as well. The great Jamaican philosopher-poet Robert Nesta Marley famously said, "Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds." I want to repeat an encouragement that I offered as part of this address, one that is companion to the truth that I began with. When discussing slavery and its resulting institutions and practices, we must always start by reclaiming racial equality, the dignity of Africans, the humanity of our ancestors who were enslaved, and as a matter of course, our own humanity. We must also remember to reclaim our humanity because when we absorb too much of the language of violence and erasure, we can stop hearing the language of truth that exists within us. When we're in that state of mind, our minds become enslaved. In his book, the Guyanese writer Walter Rodney quotes a Dutch traveler's first impressions upon visiting the Nigerian city of Benin. He says the towns seemed very great. When you enter into it, you go into a great broad street. The town is composed of 30 main streets, very straight, 120 feet wide. The houses are close to one another, arranged in very good order. These people are in no way inferior to the Dutch as regards cleanliness. This was his quotation. In 1531, a Portuguese sailor, Vicente Pegado, traveled to the city of Great Zimbabwe. And this was what he wrote. He said, "Among the gold mines and the inland plains between the Limpopo and Zambezi River is a fortress built of stone of marvelous size. And there appears to be no mortar joining the stones. This edifice is almost surrounded by hills, upon which are others resembling it in the fashioning of stone and the absence of mortar. And one of them is a tower more than 12 fathoms high." A 2016 article in the Guardian newspaper highlighted the city of Great Zimbabwe, built between the 11th and 14th century. And the article described a centuries-old drainage system that remained operational, funneling water from the houses and enclosures down into the valley. And the article also disclosed how, in the 19th century, European visitors to this abandoned medieval city in Great Zimbabwe refused to believe that indigenous Africans could have built such an extensive network of monuments. Here's the thing. The greatness that is within us will always outweigh the injustices that have been visited against us. Despite what we've been through for centuries, our survival is a testament to that fact. In closing, I would like to offer this quote by Nelson Mandela. And he says, Our human compassion binds us the one to the other, not in pity or patronizing, but as human beings who have learned how to turn our common suffering into hope for the future. Truth begins with language. Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, tomorrow we vote on a historic resolution that will be another step in the journey of establishing truth. We stand united as Africans, whether on the continent or any part of the world, and link up with people of conscience around the world to seek truth and justice and restore the dignity and humanity of victims of the slave trade. This is a resolution of destiny. And I hope all of you will vote tomorrow to establish truth so that together we can pass this historic resolution and finally acknowledge the full horrors of these transgressions against humanity of the approximately 15 million human beings who were enslaved. I thank you very much for your attention.
We thank you, President John Dramani Mahama of the Republic of Ghana, in his capacity as the African Union champion on slavery and reparations. We thank you very much in the audience for this section or this portion of the discussions. We are now about to break into a more in-depth, a more detailed, a more captivating part of our proceedings here today. And we still crave your attention because I am about to hand us over to a very distinguished woman who is a historian. She's a historian. She's a rapporteur of the African Union Committee of Experts on Reparations, Dr. Panashe Chigumadzi. I hope I pronounced that right. Maybe I should be a Zimbabwean and say Maswita. Thank you very much. Over to you, Dr. Chigumadzi. Thank you.
Good morning, Excellencies. All protocols observed. I want to take a leaf from our Osajefo, who has given us a wonderful keynote or something to really stay with, and I think it's quite important. Truth begins in language. So let me begin with something from a language of my region, isiXhosa. Akukho zinyani lemvubu ladliwa zingwenya kwaceba iziziba. It never happens that the hippo's child is eaten by the crocodile and the pool remains still. There must be consequences. There must be historical accountability. This is the Ubuntu, which many of us grew up with and lived with. This is the philosophy that anchors the AU framework for reparations. A crime does not rot, 1444 to present, which I have the honor of serving as the rapporteur. It is a radical vision of the African philosophy of Ubuntu that demands reparations and consequences. It insists that when a crime is committed against a child, against a people, the community, the world cannot remain still. The waters must move, the mothers must rise. And this is rooted in Pan-African legal philosophy of intergenerational consequences of crimes, shared across philosophies such as Ubuntu, Utu, Butu, Hunu, Maye, Omoalabi, Safu. Across the continent, our ancestors declare, Ichala aliboli, Mulato hauboli, mosho aiwori, deni ailozi. A crime does not rot. It does not compose. Time cannot wash a crime away until it is addressed through repair. We gather here today because the pool has not been still. For 6 centuries, Africans on the continent and in the diaspora have refused to let it be still. Through testimony, armed struggle, state diplomacy, and the strategic use of courts and petitions. This panel is one more wave in that 6th century Afrikaner abolitionist and reparations movement. Now, importantly, today we wage part of the intellectual struggle of correcting the historical record. 250 years ago, in 1776, Adam Smith declared in his seminal Wealth of Nations that the rounding of the Cape of Good Hope and the so-called discovery of the Americas in 1492 were the 2 most important events in the history of mankind. Smith named geography, he named navigation, he named global commerce. What he did not name, what he could not bring himself to name, was the engine that made this possible: the trafficking of enslaved Africans. Adam Smith saw the world that the crime built, and he described it as if the crime had never happened. Without it, there was no capital to finance the voyages, no labor to extract the wealth, no system to sustain empire. The ship's route was not the rupture, the enslaved bodies in the hull were. Similarly, Hannah Arendt, in her seminal The Origins of Totalitarianism, argued that 20th century Western totalitarianism constituted the fundamental break in European civilization. Of course, Amy Césaire demonstrated that Hannah Arendt was wrong. This was merely the boomeranging of colonial procedures back onto Europe. And of course, we know the Westphalian Canard that modern sovereignty and political modernity began with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. The AU framework intervenes in these historical debates about the origins of the modern world and corrects the record. It insists that none of these accounts names the corrective rupture without placing the trafficking in enslaved Africans at its center. It names the inception of the trafficking of enslaved Africans during the so-called Age of Discovery as the definitive break in world history, the event that shattered localized feudal orders and inaugurated the modern world racial capitalist system, transforming the fates and fortunes of all peoples across the world, both during and after slavery's legal end. Every regime of labor, property, capital, and sovereignty that governs this hall today had its origins in that break. That break did not stay in Africa. It went everywhere. We're traveling in the orbit of a crime so vast and dense as gravity reconfigured the Earth's trajectory. Most of us do not know. Just as a fish cannot tell that it is swimming in water, it's difficult to know when you're swimming inside it. 6 centuries ago, the Atlantic came to surround us all, not as an event, but the environment, the structure and the conditions that make all life as we know it possible. In the Americas, indigenous peoples were dispossessed and eliminated to clear the land. Enslaved Africans were forced to extract its wealth, and communal territories were recast as private property, hardwiring racial domination into the foundations of modern capitalism. In Europe, the capital extracted from the plantation funded the Industrial Revolution and transformed the European peasant into the modern industrial proletarian. In Asia, the profits of the Atlantic trafficking financed the consequences or conquest of India and the Opium Wars in China. And when abolition came, the plantation infrastructure was simply restructured or simply restocked with indentured Indian and Asian labor. In Africa, the removal of the most productive generations shattered sovereignty, militarized economies, and laid the ground for the scramble for Africa. The global backlash to emancipation epitomized what it meant when Europeans stopped stealing Africans from their lands and began stealing the lands from Africans. That plantation logic was brought to Africa. In my own Southern Africa, the infamous compound mining system was the engine of the 19th century minerals revolution, which created the monstrous wealth of men like Cecil John Rhodes. Moreover, what is most important is that that system, the compound mining system, was directly modeled on Brazilian slave mining systems. Slavery was not a metaphor, it was the blueprint for development both before and after abolition. The Masters and Servants Acts that dominated apartheid labor relations up until the 1970s were first introduced after abolition in the 19th century to discipline free labor across the British Empire. Long before Adam Smith theorized the beginnings of the modern world, our ancestors understood that this was world-breaking and world-redefining. They said it in our languages before any Western academy named it. In Southern Africa, when settlers came, our ancestors cried, "Ilizwe lifile," the world is dead. It was not only that black people suffered a social death, but the land and the world suffered death too. On the Swahili slave coast, our Africans cried, "Kifa urongo." This is what Toni Morrison meant in 1988 when she said, "Slavery broke the world in half. It broke it in every way." She was not speaking metaphorically, she was making a structural argument, the same argument that the AU framework makes. This is not a competition of suffering. It is a recognition of a world that is broken and requires a world-making and world-rebuilding reparations agenda. A cardiologist who identifies the heart as the organ failure, which causes systematic collapse, is not ranking organs. We're simply naming the beginnings of the rot. It is a structural diagnosis. And the question this panel exists to advance is, what does naming this diagnosis require of all of us, legally, economically, politically, and morally in the 21st century? Here's how the next 90 minutes will work. We will spend the first 30 minutes in round one with 4 panelists, Professor Edem Adote, Professor Jennifer L. Morgan, and Professor Charles Jallow, who will give the structural diagnosis in 4 concrete dimensions: its historical specificity, its economic lineage, its gendered architecture, and its legal consequences. I'll introduce each of them fully as we proceed. We will then spend 20 minutes in round 2 putting the structural diagnosis to work, giving what the break built and what does dismantling it require. What does the structural argument say to the delegation that insists that this is not their history? What does it add that moral suasion cannot? We will then hear for 30 minutes from our 4 respondents, Reverend Al Sharpton, Dr. Amara Inya, Mr. Benjamin Crump, and Professor Vereen Shepherd. Starting with round 1, we have Professor Edem Adote, who will give us the historical origins, helping us understand what exactly is exceptional in the break that we identify in 1444. Professor?
Good morning, everyone.
Let me give you your bio. It is Professor Edem Adote, who is Associate Professor of African History at the Institute of African Studies, University of Ghana. He is a Pan-Africanist scholar with special interests in the transatlantic trafficking of enslaved Africans and European colonialism in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Thank you, His Excellency. All protocols observed. I would like to start off from where His Excellency the President left us, which is the issue of terminology. And I think this is very important because it helps to put in proper historical context the issues we are discussing today. In most of the history textbooks that we read, we see the subject matter described as the transatlantic slave trade. But this obscures a couple of issues, and I'm just going to deal with 3 of them. One is the fact that when we talk about the transatlantic slave trade in quotes, we are talking about 2 related but separate issues here. One is the slave trade, and 2 is slavery. These are related but separate, and it's important that we make that distinction. And again, it's important we raise that because when it comes to the history of the transatlantic slave trade, the slave trade was abolished earlier, and it took several decades for the slave-owning nations to abolish the institution, which clearly tells us that these are 2 separate issues that we are dealing with. So, for example, Britain, for instance, abolished the trade in 1807, but abolished the institution in 1834. And even then said that enslaved Africans had to be apprenticed for 4 years before they acquired their freedom. Similarly, Denmark, which was one of the very first nations to abolish the trade, did that in 1803. But it took a slave rebellion in their Danish plantations in 1848 for the institution to be abolished. So we are talking about two issues here, and we need to pay attention to that. The second point that I want to make has to do with classifying the subject matter as a trade, because it gives the impression that we are just dealing with a normal economic routine of buying and selling of goods or products. But that is not necessarily the case. We are talking here about the forcible seizure of people whose productive and reproductive labor was exploited without compensation for centuries. So it's important that when we're talking about trade here, we understand that this is just not a normal trade that we're talking about. And I'm happy that on the brochure, we're talking about trafficking of enslaved peoples. This is not a trade that we are talking about. It is important we address that. And the third point that I want to highlight has to do with the issue about African slaves. And again, that is also very important because some apologies for the transatlantic slave trade, again in quotes, make the argument that many people in Africa were already slaves when they came here. So what they did was just to feed into an existing trade or institution and just took off people who were already slaves. So what they did to them was actually rather benefiting them because there was nothing special about what was happening. But in as much as the institution of slavery existed, and there's going to be another discussion on the nature of what existed here, these people were taken were not necessarily slaves. Many of them were free people who were captured, forcibly seized, and shipped across the Atlantic. So we are not talking about African slaves here, we are talking about enslaved Africans, and I'm happy that is also captured in the title. And to re-emphasize the point that these were not African slaves, but people who were enslaved, as our president rightly pointed out. We see that these people rebelled right from the very onset, from 1441 when the first group of Africans were taken away, right through the 15th century. We find King Afonso in the Congo writing to the King of Portugal protesting why free people were being taken away. We have instances of the rebellions in the Americas, the Maroon Age. We talk about even the slave wars in Golu, in the Upper East region of Ghana. All these instances show that these people were not goods, neither were they trade items, but these people were humans who were free, who wanted their independence. And right from the onset, they resisted their enslavement, and it's important that we put this in proper context. So that is the first that I want to discuss. The second also has to do with the origins. Again, it's also about some historical inaccuracies in the records that we use. Now, many of us are told that the Europeans came to Africa and were traded in gold till about the latter part of the 15th century when the Americas was discovered in quotes, and the need for labor because the indigenous people could not produce the kind of labor that existed. This is historically inaccurate. Right from the onset when the Portuguese came in the 15th century, they were kidnapping and shipping Africans across to Europe. So the enslavement, the kidnapping and enslavement of Africans started way before plantation slavery in the Americas. And the other important point I also want to make is that this issue of enslavement of Africans also occurred in Africa before it was transported across the Atlantic. The Portuguese and the Spanish had plantations on the coast of Africa. We talk about Sao Tome, Canary Islands, we can talk about Convened. All these places were plantations that the Portuguese and the Spanish employed or used enslaved African labor to produce sugar and other products in these spaces. So when we talk about the Europeans being around for a while and trading in just what we later call legitimate goods, gold and other products, this is not wholly accurate. Right from the onset, they were stealing Africans and shipping them across. They were pillaging societies and creating havoc in all these places, and it's important that this historical information it's also put out there. The third point I would like to discuss has to do with the structural organization of the so-called trade. As I pointed out, these were not slaves, these were free people who were enslaved. So we need to understand how the African became a slave, what I call the making of the African slave. This involved four stages. 1, acquisition; 2, captivity; 3, use; and 4, treatment. And I think the most important point I want to make is that this was systemized, this was systemic enslavement of Africans. And the reason why I make this argument has to do with the origins and the role that institutions played in organizing this trade. For instance, right from the onset, there were debates in European parliaments regarding the shipment of Africans across the Atlantic. It is interesting to know that between 1619 and 1714, there were 16 parliamentary sessions in the British Parliament debating whether to have a joint stock company or open trade in enslaved Africans. Now, beyond that, there were also agreements between nations to determine who should supply enslaved Africans to their colonies in the Americas. So again, for instance, in 1713, there was an agreement between Spain and Britain, what we call the Asiento, granting it a monopoly on enslaved Africans for its colonies. And under it, they were supposed to supply 4,800 enslaved Africans per year for 30 years. So we see the kind of relationships that existed that enabled these enslavement of Africans. The third also has to do with laws on the treatment and use of these enslaved Africans, who were primarily treated as chattel, as property. And many of you will know of the slave ship Zong, which in 1781 let's say that the captain threw overboard over 100 Africans on the ship, and actually went on to claim insurance for the number of people that had been thrown on the slave ship, which clearly told you that there were laws that enabled some of these things to take place. Of course, later on, it was thrown away, but the first instance, he won. Now, beyond that, we also have black codes or the slave codes that were all over the spaces that regulated the kind of relationships that existed between enslaved peoples and their masters. Many of them reinforced the idea that these people were property. So it's not surprising that many of the rules that we find in this period have several enslaved people as part of the property that are bequeathed to their heads. So you find a spoon, a table, a land, cattle, and you find in there a Kwame or a John or a Ben or something else. And this clearly tells you how these people were treated primarily as chattel. Now, these are some of the key issues I want to raise for now. But the most important point I would like to conclude with is the fact that when we talk about this trade, again, trade in quotes, in enslaved Africans, we are just not talking about a normal trade. We are talking about humans, and I think that is always forgotten in the conversation, that we are talking about humans whose consent was neither sought in these exchanges, whose labor, reproductive and sexual, was exploited without compensation for centuries. And it's important that we put at the center of this conversation the human beings that we are talking about. And what makes this trade, again in quotes, unique was the fact that it was racially based, it was permanent, it was hereditary enslavement of Africans, and the trafficking of Africans across the Atlantic and their enslavement also set the foundation for the racialized, exploitative global regime that persists today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. And we'll come to the gendered aspect And one, just to make sure we understand that gender doesn't necessarily mean woman, just like race doesn't mean black. We have to think very expansively about what the slave trade meant, or rather in trafficking in enslaved Africans. And as we heard from the president, that in 1662, Virginia enacted an unprecedented legal principle, partus secretive interim, which for the first time in human history made the status of enslavery heritable through the mother's womb. So working in a long line of Black radical feminist thought that has placed the experience of Black women at the center of analysis of racial capitalism, not as a special case, but as a clarifying instance. Professor Morgan, your scholarship has established that this was not a secondary provision, but the system's reproductive engine, the very mechanism through which the trafficking made itself permanent and self-sustaining across generations. Can you establish what this specifically inaugurated, why it is central rather than supplementary to the world that the trafficking built, and importantly, how does that logic continue to shape the world today? For example, you might reference the so-called Moynihan Report in the 1960s, in the post-civil rights moment, and the ways in which Black women are continued to be figured as emasculating or the center of the destruction of Black families. How does this logic begin with slavery? And I just want to give us a little bit of background into her phenomenal scholarship. Professor Jennifer L. Morgan is a historian at New York University specializing in slavery, gender, and the Black Atlantic. She is a 2024 MacArthur Fellow, Genius, and Mellon Fellow at the New York Public Library. She's best known for Reckoning with Slavery, which was published in 2021, and Laboring Women, published in 2004. Her scholarship examines how race, gender, reproduction, and capitalism shaped systems of slavery, and her work on reproductive racial capitalism has become foundational to understanding the system that the break built.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to begin with just humble thanks for the invitation to participate in this morning's crucial and historic event. As you have noted in the section of the Declaration on the progressive codification of the racialized chattel enslavement of Africans, one of the markers of the transatlantic slave trade and the hereditary racial slavery that infused the Atlantic world beginning in the 15th century was, and I'm quoting the Declaration now, the unprecedented biologically inheritable status of property through the womb of enslaved women, close quote. So it's this distinction that I want to elaborate for you here this morning, building on what you've already learned in this room from His Excellency President John Dramani Mahama. In 1662, the legislative body of the Virginia colony, Englishmen known as the House of Burgesses, met and passed the following law. Whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by any Englishman upon a Negro woman shall be slave or free, be it therefore enacted and declared by this present Grand Assembly that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother. This law did two things. It punished interracial sex, but more importantly, it clarified the status of all children born to Black women. The women who were laboring in the 17th century Black Atlantic world, whose status became part of how Europeans decided that enslaving Africans was both legal and moral. And they did so through the kind of legislative and practical maneuvers that the 1662 law both sheds lights on and clears the way for. The Virginia legislators passed this law at a moment when there were actually very few enslaved Africans in the colony of Virginia. Although more than 1 million people had been captured and transported to the Americas by 1660, enslavers in Virginia, as in much of the rest of the 17th century mainland North American colonies, had only just begun a journey towards developing the full-scale slave societies that would develop in the American South and the embrace of the slave economy that would characterize colonies in the North. But they knew what they were reaching for, and they understood the significance of Black women's bodies in the architecture of what they were building. Slavery had long existed in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, but this thing that we are grappling with today, this was new. And the Virginia legislators offer us some insight into how hereditary racial slavery in the Atlantic world both developed and was codified. Because it was more than simply attaching slave status to the children of the enslaved. That too had occurred. This was naturalizing the status of enslavement, locating it not in warfare or captivity, but in an embodied commodification, because the act transformed human beings from captives into naturally produced commodities. When the members of the House of Burgesses legislated that the condition of the child followed that of the followed that of the mother, they removed that child from the family and they placed that child in the marketplace. We should remember that there were many legal routes through which a child conceived out of wedlock could be rendered illegitimate, both by European courts and churches. But that is not what this law did. This law took its form and its cadence from English common laws that concerned animal husbandry, that assigned the ownership of a calf to the owner of a cow, not the owner of the bull. The violence attending this law is multi-layered. It removes from the slave owner's legal and moral framework his paternal relationship with the child he conceives on the body of an enslaved woman, certainly. That child becomes his property, not his progeny. But we shouldn't linger entirely on the specter of interracial violence because, again, to quote the Declaration, racialized chattel enslavement was historically unprecedented in its legal and structural design, being the first global regime to codify human beings and their descendants as inheritable, alienable, and perpetual property, to convert human reproduction into a mechanism of capital accumulation. Atlantic slavery began with the Middle Passage, with the capturing and loading of human beings on board ships, transporting them in chains across an ocean. The 1662 law offered slave owners a crucial conceptual shortcut. It turns African and Black women's birth canals into a Middle Passage. It forced them to deliver commerce, not kinship, through their bodies. It enacted a violation that is frankly mind-boggling, as it is rooted in the claim that kinship, that most fundamental of human relationships, did not apply to Africans or people of African descent. Toni Morrison wrote in 1988 that slavery broke the world apart. It broke it in every way. We could talk further about what it does to legislate that a Black child is not part of a family, but is a commodity that enriches the family of the white people who own her. About the fact that a Black child's banishment into the public, into the market, is part of the ideology that helps Europeans define themselves as white, as deserving of private life, as free. The slave owner's child will inherit the slave owner's property. It's a distinction that is soaked in the blood of the Black child, whether she is the actual daughter of the slave owner or not. But I am not here to talk about the white family, but to talk about the descendants of captive Africans, to talk about what it means to try to name the violations that are at the heart of the structural realities that hereditary racial slavery produces. In my focus on reproduction, on birth, on kinship, on family, you might mistakenly presume that I am focused on the personal, on the experiential, but I'm committed, as I believe all of us here are, to understanding the structural effects that hereditary racial slavery had on the development of modern capitalism, on the legitimation of colonialism and colonial violence, on the enduring presumption that Black people are not meant to be free. Slavery broke the world apart. It did so by rendering an entire continent of people kinless. The 1662 law codified the belief that Black women could give birth only to slaves. That belief and practice, unconnected, by the way, to the fact that Black people's mortality rates meant that very few actual children were conceived or survived their infancy on plantations in the Americas, is at the core of how hereditary racial slavery was defined, justified, legislated, and thus how it endured. I do not, of course, mean to say that Black people in Africa and the Americas were so destroyed as to lose their sense of themselves as members of families, as kin, as communities. Of course not. But what I am saying is that the transatlantic slave trade is based on a claim rooted in legal and commercial precedent that Africans were kinless. Kinlessness became equivalent to enslavable, and enslavable became equivalent to black. The aftermath of that logic precipitates the structural inequalities that we fight against today, whether they are the inequalities that are rooted in the Moynihan Report's claim that black families are without any are sites of chaos, or whether it's in the fact that African American women today are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women in this country. The aftermath of that logic persists. As we fight to define the Atlantic slave trade and the hereditary chattel slavery that it produced as the gravest crime against humanity, we need to grapple with how it is embedded in a world-changing deployment of reproductive violence. We are called, therefore, to consider what reparations means in the wake of the severed human bonds that line the ocean floor, the silver mines, the sugar fields, and the tobacco farms of the Americas. Those bonds of kinship, so ruthlessly legislated away by the Virginia House of Burgesses, became the fertile ground of trade, commerce, commodification, and financial growth at devastating human cost. It is indeed time to make the world over again.